There we go. Okay, John, welcome, and please go ahead. I'm excited for your session.
Thanks you so much, Christina. I'm excited too. I don't know how all of you diehards managed to stick through 3 sessions with me. I'll try to make this one the most provocative if I can, or maybe the most generalizable. I've been trying to figure out for a long time, whether I should use these AI tools at all, and certainly when I should use them and when I shouldn't. There are many reasons, as I've mentioned in previous sessions, not to use them at all, like just never touch them. And I'm not going to discuss those today, but they include bias in training data, exploitation of workers who evaluate the tools, carbon footprint of the tools, and so forth. And I'm happy to talk about those. I don't want to eclipse that conversation. But for today's focus, I'm going to look at, on the assumption you're choosing to use one of these tools, what's an appropriate use, what's likely to give you useful or helpful results, and what's not. And I'm going to try to deflate a myth that I think is out there about the best way to decide whether to use these tools or not. And then I'm going to go into some rather divergent fields in order to try to answer the question. You're going to get a little bit of Roman history. You're going to get a little bit of thermodynamics. and then we'll bring it back at the end to a practical little poll. We'll do a little exercise ourselves to decide, in what cases would these various tasks, and I've kind of biased them a bit toward educators, but not. It's really meant to be a framework that can be applied generally to any kind of task that you might think about using AI for. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And this is just the sort of introduction, along with some socials for me. If people want to follow, I'll come back to the screen at the end. But I pitched this 3-part series as sort of with Maha's help, thinking about how the idea of relating to these sort of AIs is often personified, and they're often given sort of childlike attributes, like, oh, this is a technology in its infancy, or now I have this intern who's eager and boundless energy, and oh, we can forgive them their mistakes because they're still in sort of like growing pains. And I sort of describe the relationship to these tools as a kind of a relationship to a person, a growing child, and their various levels of maturity. This stage, the third, is really asking ourselves, should we give the kid, when it's grown enough to sort of be able to do effective work at times, should we give them the keys to the car? Is this a time when it's ready to go out in the world and do things for us that could cause damage if they're done poorly or incorrectly? And in what context is it okay to give it the keys, and in what case not? So in order to do this, though, I'm going to do a little bait and switch, because even though I tried to make some cutesy little robots for my icon, I'm actually going to talk about a more mechanistic model of how these things work, because I think the whole anthropomorphic vision of AI can only get us so far. So with apologies to Yasser and Maha, I'm going to deviate a little bit from some of the more animalistic metaphors for AI. Here's the one that I think is the most common sort of determinant. People say, well, it's high stakes versus low stakes, right? So you wouldn't want to use it because it can, fabricate falsehoods, because it's, it can have bias. It has all these potential problems with it. You wouldn't want to use it for something that's high stakes, right? You should only use it for something where there isn't a big, it's not a really important task. It's not something where, there's a real terrible outcome if something goes wrong. We want to really use it almost like a plaything, like keeping the toddler in the playpen, if you will. I think that is a bad determinant. I think it's very misleading, and it's easy to grasp for something like that, but I don't buy it. Here's why. The problem with high versus low stakes is that there's lots of things that AI is very good at that's very high stakes. For example, radiology was one of the first professions that, even before education, that was endangered by AI, because it's one of the first places where AI tools became faster and better at diagnosing, or I should say, identifying potential tumors, than humans. Right now, there's a number of studies that have concluded this. There are still concerns that I think are totally valid about validating each of the potential tumors. But you think about the idea of when a machine can find things in an image that more effectively and more thoroughly than a human can, that's not necessarily a low stakes situation. In fact, it's very high stakes for the people who could have cancer. So that's a good example where AI should be used, in my opinion, for high stakes situations. Well, you look at the other side and say low stakes. Well, John, why would it be ever bad to use AI for low stakes? By definition, it's low stakes, so it's fine. You can just play with it and it's not a problem, right? Well, this is an example that came up in a class of mine last term. And it's an online asynchronous class. We use Slack as our learning management platform. And I noticed that some of the comments that some people were making were just super generic, right? I mean, read that thing. Oh, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate your perspective and can see where you're coming from. It's always valuable to hear different viewpoints on each topic. Great job, keep it up, right? Okay, so there are people who are, super enthusiastic like that, but these comments were so generic and so sort of consistent that I called out the student. I said, look, these are just replies that we're using in Slack. You're not even graded on them, except in some generic kind of participation way. So it's low stakes. It doesn't matter, that you happen to say something nice or supportive. That sounded generic. But what it does is over time, it kind of degrades the quality of the human connection that I'm trying to foster. The reason I'm using Slack rather than something like, Blackboard is that I want to have back and forth conversation with people. I want people, even though it's an asynchronous class, to feel like they're talking to each other. And if everything starts to turn into this kind of AI generated slop, then that makes it feel like this is just an exercise in me, typing something somewhere. It's not an actual human at the other end responding to me. So, in any individual case, one of these little like conversational moments, like if you get an email from a coworker or your boss or something, might not be high stakes, but over time, they add up to a sort of degradation of the human kind of connection there. So I'm not real happy with that. And that's why I think that the high stake versus low stake example isn't really the right way to think about it. Well, if that's not how we determine when to use AI or not, what is? Well, in order to understand that, I think we have to understand some oddities of probability. Hold on, I'm going to go back to the online version, I think, because my local file is freaking out a little bit here. This should be fine. Okay, so hold on. Oddities of probability. So in this case, you have an example where there's engines. You've heard the term stochastic parrots. There are essentially these large language models are just whole billions of weights, and weights are just probabilities. They're numbers between 0 and 1. 1 means it's definitely going to be the next choice, and 0 means it's definitely not going to be the next choice. And usually there's something in between, like 0.7 or 0.8 or 0.1. And this is what you've heard the idea of auto prediction, like, oh, these LLMs are basically predicting the next word in sequence. Choosing that word is a probabilistic exercise. It has a number of different choices of which word it's going to pick, and it will pick a word that is essentially at random, except for the fact that the words have different weights, right? So we'll get into how those weights are chosen later, but that's a probabilistic situation. And probabilities are something that a lot of people misunderstand. They don't get it right. They have misconceptions about them. And here are some examples you might have seen. I'm going to call these opportunistic solutions. So these are particular scenarios where people's intuition leads them astray. One is the birthday paradox. So how many people we have in this room? I don't know, maybe 20 or so. It turns out that when you get more than 23 people in a room, chances are 2 of them have the same birthday. Now that sounds absurd, right? Because there's 365 possibilities for birthday, technically 366. How can, you might do some simple math like, oh, 23 divided by 365 is a number way less than 0.5, like that. It's not even a 50% chance that that's going to happen. But the problem with thinking that way is that you're thinking about any one of those people having my birthday. But once you start pairing people up and consider all the possible pairings of people, then it turns out that there are so many possible pairings that number exceeds the number of, or exceeds the likelihood that no 2 people in the room will share a birthday. And this is a great class exercise. Do it every time you have a classroom full of people, or even a meeting where you have more than 23 people. It's not guaranteed because it's probabilistic, but chances are if it's over 23, you will have two people with the same birthday, like March 15th or something. It's kind of a shocker when it happens. And it gives you a sense of how opportunistic solutions, where it doesn't matter, you're not matching any one person, you're just trying to see if any people match, are extraordinarily likely. Here's another example that's even more extreme. A chance of your next breath containing a molecule of Julius Caesar's dying breath. So he's like, et tu, Brute, and he breathes out his last lungful. Okay, now we're assuming or even mixing of the atmosphere, like between now and, whatever it was, 300 BC. And then what are the chances that one of those molecules makes it into your next lungful? Well, that seems incredibly unlikely given how big the atmosphere is. But it turns out to be extremely likely, much more likely, in fact, than 23 people in a room having the same birthday. It's 98%. How is that even conceivable, right? Like, how can we imagine that every one of my next breaths is going to contain a molecule of Julius Caesar's last breath? It's just nutty. So how is that possible? Well, I'm going to spare you guys the equations, but I drew a diagram that I hope will kind of help explain it. So let's suppose that you have the entire atmosphere over here as a series of lungfuls, right? And, you can just imagine that, there's a lot of them, millions, far more than millions. I think it's sextillions of lungfuls in an atmosphere. There's a lot, right? But there's this definite amount, right? Like the atmosphere doesn't go on indefinitely. So, okay, so one lungful takes up, a certain amount of the atmosphere. Well, Julius Caesar, let's say this upper left corner was like Julius Caesar's last breath. And those are the molecules that he had in his last breath. And this is you down in the lower right corner, and you're going to breathe your next breath, right? So for Julius Caesar's molecules to go from here to here means they have to somehow, get mixed in the whole atmosphere and somehow end up in your breath. Now, if there's few molecules for breath, that is, you only had like, in this case, I think I had 3 or 4, 2 molecules for breath. That's super unlikely because you've got so many molecules in the atmosphere that the number of molecules compared to the number of lungfuls for atmosphere is just too small. There's no way these two are going to end up, one of them is going to end up here. They're going to be in sort of random places, right? But what if you have many molecules for breath? What if you have a lot more molecules for breath than you have lungfuls in the atmosphere? Well, these are both huge numbers, but it doesn't matter because in AI, when all the stochastic stuff, we're talking about very large numbers. A Leon 5B is 5 billion. That's what the B stands for, 5 billion images that were analyzed by one data set. So we're talking about extraordinary numbers already whenever we deal with AI, with generative AI anyway, and large language models. So it's similar in some quantitative way to this question of like Julius Caesar's breath. Well, there's a crazy amount of molecules in each breath. If you've ever studied chemistry, you've heard of Avogadro's number, which is 10 to the 23rd. That's just a massive, it's like a 1 with 23 zeros after it. So it's just absolute massive number. And yeah, there's a lot of lungfuls in the atmosphere too, but in a sense, there are fewer, in a very real sense, than there are atoms in the atmosphere. What does that mean? It means there's so many of these green molecules stuck in this upper left corner that they're going to kind of like spread themselves out and will actually turn out to be likely that one of them is going to end up in your next lungful. So the idea is that when the proportion of, of successful options in any snapshot is greater than the number of samples, the number of possible snapshots, that turns out to be pretty likely. So this is absolutely a wacko concept. And I'm going to look at the chat to see if people are just scratching their heads or if they have any idea what's going on here. Jonathan is asking about molecules going into closed rooms, down deep mines. Jonathan, are you worried about being infected by by some ancient Roman disease? Because I understand. And it actually will bring up a very interesting point that's an assumption I'm making about how there is mixture of these molecules, and I'll get to that in a moment because that turns out to be important for large language models. Let's see. I know 10 people who share my birthday, 5 of them in family alone. What? How big is your family? I guess it's, that's unusual when you can say like, I know people who share my birthday, because that's an individual person. It's more like, are there any pairs of people? But still, something's going on in your family. I'm not going to make any judgments there. Yeah. So I hope that kind of makes sense the way I described it. It is a head scratcher, but it is definitely something that you can learn about if you're interested in, and I can show you the equations, but it's a consequence that if you kind of like, hey, math, no, it's just a consequence of like how many possible solutions there are. There are so many molecules in a lungful that it makes it more likely. Okay, so what the heck does this have to do with with large language models, Julius Caesar dying and us breathing in his air? Well, I think there's some parallels that are important to think about, and they help us think about when these models can be used appropriately, when they are these kind of what I'm calling opportunistic tasks or scenarios. So first, I'm going to define a couple of things. I would call sort of a snapshot a kind of microstate of the system. So it's a sampling of possible molecules or solutions or returns to a prompt. The snapshot can be large or small. And the example from Julius Caesar is a lungful. So a lungful is like a kind of a sampling of all the possible molecules in the atmosphere. And it's also the possible when you write a sentence into a large language model, or even on your iPhone typing out a beginning of a sentence, and you say something like, I'm going to go to the blank, and the iPhone is choosing between store and office and gym, then those store, office, and gym, those words are the sample. They are the snapshot of the potential words it's returning back to you. Then there's this idea of what I'm calling density. It's really not so much, well, it is sort of density in the sense of it's being a kind of, in the sense of the atmosphere, it's literally sort of like molecules, how close together they are. But in a large language model where you have a more abstract space, it's how many relevant data points are in the snapshot, right? So the concentration of useful answers near that snapshot. Was the model trained on data that has a lot of examples that are similar to what you're asking for in your prompt? Or is it sparse, so they can be dense or sparse? If it's sparse, it's like, well, there wasn't a lot on that in the internet, right? And that's a very important characteristic of a model for a particular task. It's not like a task that's necessarily good or bad. It is a task that is that might be might depend on having the right kind of data in the data set to solve that task. So the example of that I mentioned is Caesar's atoms near your lungs. How dense is that sort of like probability? And as I've tried to show you before, that's actually quite possible. In fact, it's very possible, very probable. Then there's temperature, and this gets to I think it was Jonathan's question about like, can you escape Caesar's breath by hiding in a mine or going up on top of a building, right? So if for those of you who studied physics or whatever, if a temperature of a gas is completely cold, that's like 0 degrees Kelvin, none of the molecules move. That's sort of what we mean by temperature, is how in a physical or chemical context, how quickly the molecules are kind of moving around, bumping into each other. So when you go outside and it's hot, the air molecules are bumping into you, and it's so that's the sort of definition of temperature from a physical or chemical perspective. Well, we can also think of temperature as the variety of possible answers in the snapshot. In other words, if Julius Caesar breathed his breath and I breathe my breath and the molecules never move, well, I'm going to keep breathing the same air over and over, and he breathed his air and it's going to stay over on the other side of the world in Rome. We'll never interact with each other's breath. But if there's some non-zero temperature, then a molecule is going to move around, and the more higher the temperature, the faster they're going to move around, the more variety there is going to be in your next breath. So temperature is a measure of variety. It's a measure of how many possible answers there are in the snapshot. It can be hot or cold, obviously. That's literally terms that we use for large language models, as well as the air quality. And the example from the Julius Caesar example is sort of the molecular mixing in the atmosphere. So here we're doing this crazy dance of talking about Julius Caesar and talking about thermodynamics, but there's a reason for this madness, which is that I think this is a really good way to think about large language models. Instead of thinking of them as children or agents or robots or even parrots, we can think of them as essentially a kind of gas. There's a thermodynamic system, like a cloud of data And that cloud can be energetic. It can have high temperature and entropy and things like that. It can also be dense or sparse in different parts of the cloud, right? And that's a really, I think, a much more mechanistic, maybe less colorful, but a much more accurate way of thinking about large language models. And we want to think about them the right way if we're trying to decide whether we should use them or not. So this, I'm calling it the Caesar scenario. Like, when do we get this kind of like super, wow, it just pulled this wonderful thing out of a haystack, right? And I'm thinking of someone from yesterday's panel, and maybe they're still here, who found, I asked people to do a random connection exercise, and someone said, I had things they could pull from two columns that had nothing to do with each other. And someone said, like, what about Simone Biles and electric vehicles, EV cars? And it was like, oh, Simone Biles is a brand spokesperson for electric vehicles companies. And we were like, no, that's not true. But yeah, Maha mentions it wasn't platypus, because I tried the platypus. It was hamsters and immunotherapy, right? That was Bonnie's example. Bonnie, can you say just what happened when you tried that yesterday?
Yes, well, mine was both of the examples you gave. So the Simone Biles, I had no idea what it would tell me, and then it made something up in terms of there's not this connection. It was a false example, but then I knew there was a super random connection between hamsters and infertility, because I've gone through infertility. And so I already knew, I could anticipate there's some really mind-bending things that would come up, because I experienced it in my lived experience. And so I knew they make hormones for women who are going through infertility to stimulate things, and they're based on hamsters' ovaries and their hormones and stuff. So there's just really, really random hamster stuff it popped it up. It was really marvelous to see. So something I didn't know anything about, is there any really random connection between Simone Biles and electric cars? And then something I really know, there's super random connections. It was really fun to see what I came up with.
That is amazing. And I called it the Caesar scenario, but it could have been the hamster scenario. Maha just posted that there actually is literally evident, kind of investigations, research into platypuses and gene imprinting. So I literally picked like the most random animals I could think of. It's pretty remarkable that generative AI found this kind of connection between hamsters and immunotherapy. Why? Because there was a point in between, and as I've mentioned in the previous talks, averaging is the way that these large language models work. So if there's some factual sort of training data that is in between the kind of elements in essentially the sort of snapshot region that you're looking for, so in between hamsters and immunology, then it can surface that. And that's, I called it a Caesar moment. We could call it a hamster moment, but it's the potential that these tools have to really blow our minds. And in this case, Bonnie, you kind of cheated, because you knew ahead of time there was something. But what if you hadn't known? What if you were just like shooting in the dark, doing research, and you used a tool like this to find a cure for cancer or some other remarkable thing? And that's why I think there's still reasons to think about when to use these tools, even if they have all these defects. But we'll get into when it's probably not a good idea to use them. So back to the sort of screen sharing here. Let's talk about the prerequisites for this kind of hamster or Caesar scenario. So one of them is that you have to have a high density, right? You can't have, there's a very unlikely that a correct answer is going to make its way into the screenshot. You have to have a lot of correct answers, ideally. That certainly helps when there is the sort of Caesar scenario, when there's many possible solutions relative to the number in the screenshot. So there aren't going to be that many in the screenshot, and there are a lot of possible solutions. The way that there's a lot of possible molecules in Caesar's last breath, but there aren't as many lungfuls in the atmosphere. And then the other thing I would say is a prerequisite is a high temperature. So again, if the atmosphere was very cool and there wasn't much mixing, then there's no guarantee that one of his molecules would have ended up in our next lungful. So this means the attempted solutions vary with each snapshot. That is, that there's a lot of different churn and a lot of different possible options that kind of come out. So let's talk about some of the problems when these aren't fulfilled. So insufficient density is a big problem. When Simone Biles turned out to be a fake brand ambassador, according to ChatGPT, that was because there was nothing in the space between Olympic gymnasts and electric vehicles. there was just an emptiness of data. And because the large language models do not go out and check in the world, and they don't even check against training data, they have been trained on that data, but they don't go and look at it. They're just going to interpolate something that fits in the middle there. And that's why we got yesterday that this gymnast was purported to be a brand ambassador for something she wasn't. It's sort of like this, again, to fall back on the anthropomorphic metaphor, this intern who's so eager to please that they make up stuff that isn't true. One of the examples of this that I think is particularly disturbing is this obituary spam. Has anybody heard of this? So this is really awful. Essentially, in order to get sort of search attention and drive ad revenue and this sort of thing from search engines, companies and individuals are creating fake obituaries using AI based on just some random details that they can figure out about a person. And you see in some newsfeed or whatever the people who died in a local area. We're not talking about like I don't know, David Bowie or something. We're talking about individuals who just live in a small town in Ohio. And these AI generated obituaries are sort of thrown online to get more eyeballs and get attention for their ads. But someone who hears on Facebook or word of mouth that someone has died, a relative or a distant friend, will look up their name and find these fake obituaries instead of the real ones. And this is really, I think, completely immoral, because you're sometimes there's kind of falsehoods or fabrications that are littered with these, or they're too vague or general, or they refer to quotes from people who don't exist. There's one case where someone didn't actually die yet. they were listed in an obituary. So this is the sort of textpocalypse scenario, right? Where AI fills in gaps and with nonsense that makes it harder for us to find the truth. So this is an example I would describe of insufficient density. There isn't enough written about someone, particularly that person dying. This is typically not valuable or useful or effective on public figures. It's some random person who, someone's grandma who lives in, like I said, a small town, rural town. There's just not much information about them on the internet that's open to search queries. And so the AI can kind of step in and make falsehoods there. In this case, it's deliberate. People are doing this to get clickbait, but you can imagine that this is the kind of thing that can happen accidentally as well, these sort of data voids. So when you don't have sufficient density, AI can definitely be a problem, and I don't think should be used in most cases. Another problem is when your temperature is too low. So again, I talked about temperature in the context of sort of this cloud of molecules, but temperature is also a characteristic of large language models, and it's how sort of varied the answers will be to your results. How much it's going to like fit the data perfectly and give you only the most likely answer. That's a cold, low temperature, versus how it's going to kind of like scatter around and pick more random results. That's a high temperature. But your temperature can be too low, as in this example of failure of AI to help detect and diagnose COVID-19. So, everybody thought like, wow, this AI is going to be great. Now, of course, the people who are in charge of OpenAI and Anthropic and so forth will say, well, we didn't have the latest, best models when COVID came out. And that's true. COVID came out several years ago, before DALL-E, before ChatGPT. But there was a lot of investment from the healthcare field into AI. I mentioned before the success in radiology that long predated ChatGPT. So wouldn't it be great at finding, vaccines? Well, it turns out that AI played basically no role in finding the vaccines for COVID, even though researchers spent tons of money on it. And I think the reason is that the AI was what we call overfitted to the data, meaning that it didn't allow for enough lateral thinking, enough varied responses. It tried to kind of pin things down to too precisely, what I would call a low temperature response. There's one example from the study was that they showed pictures of patients and said, like, can you get you diagnose whether this person has COVID or whatever. And it seemed this one model seemed to do quite well and diagnose whether people were going to die of COVID. And later it turned out it just decided it based on whether they were lying down. If they were in a bed rather than sitting up or standing, it said like, well, they're probably going to die. So that's not the kind of lateral thinking, really more a kind of an investigative speculation that we need in lots of areas of research. So that's an example of temperature being too low. Well, it's really easy to find examples of temperature being too high. This guy that's a lawyer who wrote a docket or a brief in which he cited several court cases that didn't exist. That's where the model is set high enough so that it's inventing things and just coming up with essentially autocomplete from things that are not even near data in the snapshot, not even near data in the sort of proximity of the prompt. And you can think of a lot of the things you've seen Google AI overviews, making horrible, what's her name? I'm trying to forget who posted an example of where she said, how many, if I have X number of, cousins, how many sisters do I have or something? They came up with 960. Like, how do you generate a number like, oh yes, you probably have 960 brothers and sisters. I mean, that's just Jane Rosenzweig. Anyway, so temperature being too high is clearly a problem for certain tasks, especially when you want something to be right, and legal briefs are usually supposed to be right. So I'd like to think about a graph here when we take these two axes, sort of temperature, obviously, cold on the bottom, hot on the top. Yeah, was there a question? Okay,
John, Maha was just asking Christina to save the chat, but I have a quick question about this that
sure.
I suspect others might have. I have a hard time because I hear a lot about this temperature thing, the hot versus the cold. But every time I go into a different AI tool, I find myself having to really slow myself down and go, now, which one was hot again? Is that like for temperature? Could you help me connect the dots between the analogy of temperature, hot, cold versus what you just said? I understand it on a factual level.
Isn't it like that game where you're trying to find something and you're hot when you're close to it and it's cold when you're far away from it? That's how I understand.
Unfortunately, it's not, Maha. It's actually the opposite.
See, that's confusing.
It is confusing.
It is confusing. I'm glad I asked because I can't be the only one confused.
Good question. It's a really good question. So, oh gosh, I could talk about the sort of physics analogy because the more hot something is, the more the molecules are kind of moving around and more likely you're going to get something that you didn't expect.
So then
when I show this kind of picture here,
Jonathan said entropy. So the randomness is what's more.
Yeah, it's related to entropy. Entropy is technically a slightly different parameter in large language models. But if you think about this picture here, which I tried to see if I can show it closer. So imagine your snapshot is that blue kind of box, right? So that maybe is the next thing that's going to come about in your auto prediction. Like when I say something like, she walked into my blank, right? And so if temperature is at 0, then the molecules aren't going to move, and it's going to find the one sort of answer that is kind of a precise average of all the expectations to go with that prompt. In that case, it might be she walked into my office or she walked into my doorway or something like that. If you then up the temperature a little bit, well, now you allow for more solutions that are nearby to kind of move around and maybe enter that snapshot and become the final result. And in that case, the value, the system samples from things that are a little further away in probability space. So then you might get, she walked into my life, or she walked into my dreams. And then if you turn the temperature way the hell up, you can get something like she walked into my orangutan we mentioned, I think, last time. Just some word that's like, what? Like that has no bearing on anything, right? That's the sort of that's the sort of relationship between temperature in the context of text generation. But we could also talk about, yeah, so I think Maha's got it right. Temperature is how much randomness and movement away from average. So when you do let's see how I put this. When ChatGPT or the like gives you an answer to a question, it literally actually has a whole bunch of answers that come out of the neural network. So as I mentioned, the word, office, car, dreams, life, orangutan, those are all possible answers. And each of them has a little number next to them. That's the probability that results from the training. But if it always picked the one with the highest probability, then you'd never get any variety. And every answer to every prompt would be the same. And that's not true. That when a student asks, for a 5-paragraph essay on the French Revolution, it's going to be different each time. That makes detection hard, but it's because there's this probabilistic aspect of like the temperature. The temperature is going to be like, well, let's not pick the word office this time. Let's pick the word dream, or let's pick this or that. And so you can, with some of these systems, especially the open source ones, you can set the temperature and watch the results change dramatically. So I remember reading someone online gave an example of like, once upon a time, a knight, set forth to, and they set the temperature very low, and it was like to rescue a damsel in distress. Well, duh, that's like the most boring cliche, but it's also like the most accurate in terms of reflecting the data that's out there. If you set the temperature higher, you might set out to, the knight set out to, solve a Rubik's Cube, or to, understand, love, or they just kind of diverge from the most likely scenario. And the more it diverges from the most likely, the higher the temperature. Another example would be image guidance. So I don't know if I have time to show this, but if you go to an image generator like Midjourney or Leonardo, which is based on Stable Diffusion, you can see something called, where is it? If I were to go based on a previous, let's suppose that I'm going to create something based on a previous model. It's around here somewhere.
John, sorry, can I interrupt? I know you're trying to focus, but I think there's another thing that's missing here. So you're talking about, so there's two things and I understand like a matrix only has two, but you can have multiple dimensions of a matrix, right? The matrix dimension that I think is really missing. So there's density, but then there's also relevance, like cultural relevance type of thing, like how diverse is the data about this topic? And then is that culture or whatever represented in the data that it has?
Right.
So not just does it have a lot of data, but does it have data that represents all possibilities culturally?
That is a really good point. So one way of thinking of it is there a density of useful data? And I've sort of glided over this important point because I said I wasn't going to deal with bias and training data. But of course, if there's lots of data about a falsehood online, something where like, you might believe a certain person stole the 2020 American election, or you might have a certain opinion about vaccines or the earth being flat. If there's a preponderance of that kind of data online, then there might be dense results for your query from that data, but it might not be useful data because the training data was not useful. So that's a good point. Let me see if I can still get to the exercise here. If not, that's fine. But what I want to do is sort of like plot out some of these kind of suggestions here and see what they do to us. If we sort of look at the situation where we have, a high temperature setting for our model, or we have dense or sparse data in the neighborhood. So here's sort of, I think, a pretty simple example. When you're brainstorming out of the box ideas, by saying it's out of the box, you're basically saying like, I'm looking for places where there aren't a lot of data, right? That's what you're triggering the language model to do. So it's going to look for places that are sparse because it's out of the box, it's not mainstream. And you want the temperature to be hot because you want it to generate lots of crazy ideas for you. I think that's a very good use of large language models. Again, it can be subject to the other problems that Maha referred to in terms of bias. But I think that's a decent, if not very trustworthy place to look. On the other hand, on the other sort of extreme, if you're looking for something that has a lot of dense data where it's a colder model, then writing code, I think, is a pretty good instance. I don't trust it completely. There are issues with it, but relatively speaking, code is a much more defined language. The sort of the space of all possible solutions, there's going to be a lot of density of the accurate solution in the space of all possible solutions, just because there are fewer words than you can use in code, and there's so many examples of code tutorials online that do a decent job of doing it right. So that's a case where you've got lots of data online that's appropriate, and you don't want it to be too crazy with proposing things. You're likely, by setting it to be cold, to get a pretty good answer, I would say. On the other hand, detecting tumors, well, there's a lot of data on that, not necessarily on the web, but in terms of medical databases that have sort of analyzed medical imagery from the past. It's private, so it's not necessarily online, but has access. Certain large language models have access to it. And there, you kind of want a little more heat, because you want to be, could this be a tumor? Could that be a tumor? You want to sort of like have that option there to check and diagnose things that are possible. And then on the other hand, prescribing drugs, like actually like saying, okay, this is the medication you should take tomorrow, especially if it's like heart medication or something like that. I think this is a kind of a dangerous possibility, because the data is going to be sparse on the individual patient, right? It might be plentiful about that drug, but not about the particular patient's own situation. And the large language model, remember, you can bias it toward individual people with prompts, but it's still heavily weighted by what it's seen in the data. And it's, if you try to do it cold, you'd get only one answer, and that might be scary. And it's the kind of problem where you don't want a whole lot of answers. You want the right answer. So I think if I was going to kind of characterize these with emoji, this is what I would say. So if you've got dense data and you want and you have a cold temperature, meaning it's going to give you only the most probable response, that's the best kind of precision. That's when you're looking for a precise answer that's probably correct. That's what I would go for. If you're looking for something that's more creative, like, hey, I'm just brainstorming and trying to find things, especially when you've got a lot of options, then a lot of data, then I would say that, that's a good use where you have hot, dense systems. When you have sparse systems, it can still be really creative, but you have no idea what you're going to get. And it might be kind of wacky, right? So out of the box ideas, a lot of those are going to be things you're going to throw away, right? In the case of tumors, because there's so much, kind of data that's been investigated, you're likely to get some valuable information, even if some of the tumors turn out, or some of the anomalies turn out not to be cancerous. That's still valuable. But when you say like brainstorm out of the box ideas and you got your temperature cranked up and there's not much data in the area, buyer beware. Who knows what you're going to get back? And then finally, I think sparse cold, when you say I'm going to get the exact answer and I only have sparse data, that's a no-no. Like I would definitely stay away from that. Maha, you had a question.
I have two questions. One of them is, I think the AI detectors are like the prescribing drugs. And I think if we use this diagram to explain to people that precision is so important if you're going to accuse students of academic, I know that the data is not that accuracy is important. But when I was looking at the hot and cold, there are two interpretations for what it means. And I was curious, is it our tolerance for hotness and coldness, or is it the actual LLM? Because like Bing has a creative mode and a precise mode. So you can ask it to try to be more precise or ask it to try to be more creative, but most other ones that I have access to don't give me that option. It gives me what it gives me. I can't tell it to be more creative.
It's hidden by most of the systems, right? You just use this oracle, like godlike, kind of pronouncement from this chatbot. Unfortunately, the closed models don't let you usually. That's why I was going to show you Leonardo, but those of you who've tried, open source models, there is a setting where you can set the parameter to hot or cold. I believe ChatGPT is set at 0.7 by default. So that's 0 to 2, I think it is temperature. So it's kind of like in the middle. But it's a really good point you mentioned, Maha. And in the interest of time, I might cheat. And I was going to ask people to sort of weigh in on this. I have a Google form and all, but let me just jump to my sense of where some of these tasks would lie. And I put grade and essay down here, which I think is similar in some ways to what you're describing about detecting student writing. There's a big impact if it's described, if you get a false positive and someone's called a cheater, even though they aren't. I think that grading an essay is an example of something where it's cold. You're only going to get like you don't want to kind of experiment like, oh, let's see what grade you get. No, you want to give a definitive answer, but there's also not enough data in the large language model to assess what that student's growth is, what they're, where they're coming from, how accurately the assignment that they produced reflects what your goal was in the assignment. On the other hand, over here in the sort of dense hot area, I have comment on an essay. And some people disagree with this, but I think that using AI to comment on essays can actually be an effective tool. I'm giving a talk later today on a 50-person student survey we did about this. It's not the same as a human commentator, but as an additional tool, I think it can be effective. Christine's like hot and dense. Yes. Thank you for mentioning.
She's doing alternative text. She's doing alternative text for what's on the screen.
Yeah, thank you. So in the hot dense quadrant, I wrote brainstorm useful solutions. That's as opposed to brainstorm out of the box solutions, which is in the hot and sparse areas. So again, the out of the box ideas are going to be like all over the place, but the useful solutions may actually be more practical because you've got more density of the data. Also in the hot, dense area, I put commenting on an essay, as I said, discovering drugs as opposed to prescribing drugs. I put prescribing drugs down in the cold, sparse area, which I would not do. I think that's a terrible idea because there's only one drug the person's going to be able to take. And if there's sparse data, it's a bad idea. I put recommending mainstream music up in the sort of hot, dense quadrant, but recommending edgy music over in the hot, sparse quadrant, where again, can I get it to kind of propose really out there kind of examples that may not be well represented in the data, but maybe I haven't thought of. I also put meetings in there, and I said, summarizing a meeting, I put in the cold dense, because I don't want a kind of crazy variety of different summaries of a meeting. I just want the facts, like just give me bullet points of what people said. And if it's not very imaginative or inventive, that's fine. I just want to find out what happened at the meeting. Another example is representing you at a meeting. There's a recent conversation about using Otter for that. I think actually it was in Bonnie's podcast with Leanne Furs, maybe. Anyway, so there are tools, there are AI tools that will summarize a meeting for you, which is helpful. Like you have a Zoom meeting, or you're not present, or you get a transcript afterward. But there are also AI tools that will show up at a meeting for you and represent your perspective. I think that's a pretty bad idea. I put it over here in the sparse cold area because again, it doesn't have enough information to know how you would react to something someone says in a meeting. And the idea that you're only going to be probably able to contribute a few things means its temperature's cold. I think that's really a poor idea. So this is a complicated chart. I'm going to try to make it simpler for you in the next 7 minutes by boiling it down to just a A or B possibility. So opportunistic versus prescriptive tasks. And more or less opportunistic is where heat is helpful and prescriptive is where cold is helpful. But it's a little more nuanced than that. But let's talk about the difference in movies. So classic opportunistic task in a movie is trying to crack a safe. Right. So you're trying one combination, it doesn't work. Try another combination, it doesn't work. Doesn't matter if you get one wrong. There's no penalty. You can just, unless it's one of those, contrived iPhone things where you only get 4 tries or something. So there's value in getting a sense of what are possible combinations to try for the password or the safe. And you don't really pay a penalty for getting them wrong. Once you get it right, boom, you can tell instantly that it's correct because the safe door opens. Everybody's happy except the person who has the valuables in the safe. A prescriptive task, which is the opposite, I would say in movies, is defusing a bomb, right? So there's always a scene where someone finds a bomb, and for some reason they're never the expert. They have to call the expert on the phone, and they say, okay, look for the red wire, look for the green wire, look for the yellow wire. The expert on the line never says, I don't know, just start clipping wires, see what happens. That would be terrible. The bomb would blow up. No. You have to know exactly which wire to clip, and you have to clip them in exactly the right order. This is a situation where it's very cold. You want a cold, kind of temperature, and you've got to get it right. So I think this is given that you don't usually know the temperature setting or the data sparsity of a density of these systems, I think you have to assume that a prescriptive problem like the kind of cutting wires is not a good use of AI, unless it's very specialized, but certainly not for large language models. So here's another just a metaphor. Opportunistic task in warfare is when you're sieging a fortress and all you have to do is find one hole somewhere around the ramparts and you stream in and you take over the city. Whereas a defensive task where you have to kind of guard every single part of the wall, that's a prescriptive task. You've got to get it all right. You can't have any errors. Any error will lead to a collapse of the system. So again, opportunistic versus prescriptive. What about healthcare? Well, again, I'm going to bring out X-rays where you're looking for potential anomalies in medical images. I think that's an opportunistic task. Yes, there is some, it's not ideal if you find something that turns out not to be cancerous, right? Because patient's distressed, you might have to do a biopsy even, but it's probably better than not finding it at all. In other words, if you can get more possibilities of things that could be cancer, you're more likely to catch the ones that are bad. Whereas heart medication would be the opposite. That's literally a prescriptive task where, if you get grandpa's, heart medication wrong, he might be dead the next morning. That's got to be cold and it's got to be dense. Like you need to make sure that that's correct. So that's a prescriptive task and one I would never rely on generative AI for. So on the one hand, we can think of this difference between prescription and opportunity as related to this sort of like the parameters of the model, right? The density versus the temperature, but we don't always have access to those. We don't always know what's going on under the hood. As Maha said, they don't always reveal that parameter setting. But if we think about tasks as more kind of creative side versus more trusted, that's also a spectrum that we can think about in terms of the opportunistic versus the prescriptive. And with that, in the absence of other information, I would say if it's an opportunistic task, go ahead, try generative AI. If it's a prescriptive task, I'd be really careful about using it for that. All right, so let's talk more about this. There's lots of questions in chat I'm really interested in catching up with, but if someone wants to say something live, I'd love to hear it.
Veronica had a really good question about the lawyer and whether there's a way to make it more precise, like the output of the AI. Is there a way to
assuming
make
the AI had access to databases like LexisNexis?
Yeah, lawyers talking about.
So I'm not a lawyer,
worries
as
me.
we say, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it wouldn't help. All right. So the premise is like, oh, we just have better data. Well, yeah, you could have every data point in your data set be perfectly trustworthy, be vetted by scientists and peer review. And yes, we know all of these things are facts. The problem is when you ask a question, you might be asking a question that resolves to a place in the data where there are no data points. In other words, in that probabilistic space, if we ask, Simone Weil and EVs, maybe there's a study, a report in there that says, breaking news, Simone Biles does not represent an EV manufacturer. Well, no one's going to write an article like that. So the AI is going to invent that because it doesn't exist. That can be true even if all the other data points are perfectly factual. So as an example, I'm not familiar so much with legal databases, but anything that uses generative AI does not go back and check the existence of currently the systems don't go back and check to see, is there sparse data there or is there missing data there? They just sort of create an average. And if there was useful data there, that's great. It's going to work for you. And if there wasn't useful data there, it's going to be creative and interesting and, potentially false. So this works to your advantage when you're asking it to write a romantic comedy, including, about string theory, because no one's ever done that before and it generates something that's, wow, this is really cool and creative. But it's a disadvantage if you ask it to, supply, legal evidence for a certain claim, and there's never been a court case to support that claim. So that's why I think that idea of like, oh, if we just trained it on better data, no, that's not necessarily going to help. I would also look up the Bloomberg's own large language model, which they attempted to train on financial data and was not more successful. In fact, it was poorer than just ChatGPT at analyzing financial data. Other questions? Please speak up, or there's a lot of great stuff in the chat, and I'm just trying to catch up with other questions people have.
I think we're pretty much out of time, but I think I can stay if other folks would like to stay as well.
Well, I don't want to keep you longer than you need to be, but I'll be here if people have more questions. Thanks again for all of you for joining me for 3 sessions straight. That's a lot.
I wish I had made the first 2. I'm going to go back and watch the videos. Thanks so much, John. And if anybody would like to stay for a little bit more and discuss, I think we can do that. I will stop the recording, however. Thanks.
That's right.